I was running a cardiology unit, and I had my office manager call me in one day, and she found out about my ex-husband. And she told me that she was going to lay me off because she couldn't handle the knowledge, knowing that I was married to him. And the nature of his crimes, apparently, in her words, freaked her out, and she couldn't deal with it, knowing that I was in the same building with her. And that makes you feel like you're a plague, like you're a cancer, like you've done something wrong. I did nothing wrong. I remember going home and thinking, what am I gonna do? You know, I have bills, I have children, I have responsibilities. There was a point in time in my life where I had nobody, where I felt very hopeless that nothing was gonna change. I'd always have the stigma of being the serial killer's ex-wife. I thought he was the most handsome thing. Dark hair, he was very muscular, and at first he was a charmer. He would buy me flowers and he would buy me chocolates. Told me everything that a young girl wants to hear. He told me he loved me. I never had anybody, including my parents, ever say, I love you. My family was very strict, overbearing on religion. There was a lot of abuse. So he was the first person that made me feel special. I thought he was the love of my life. And we also connected through a bond of abuse. He told me early on about a story that he must have been about 10 years old. There was a conflict with his father, and then he proceeded to take his right hand. He had turned on the burners to the stove and burned his hand. How could you not have empathy? He started becoming very jealous and controlling. Like even going to school, you know, like, who did you talk to? You know, like, what do you mean, who did I talk to? One day, we were just driving along, and I don't even know what triggered it, but I was accused of cheating on him. When he got mad, he would speed. Now we're going 110 and 45. It perpetually got worse and worse and worse. Just all in anger and rage. And when he pulled over, the car skidded off to the side.
Get out. Get out.
He literally dragged me out of the car. And he drove off, and I thought, how am I gonna get home? He left me stranded on the side of some road that I had no idea where I was. I don't have any idea what's going on. This was my first love. This is the first person I ever dated. I truly thought I was in love. I wish I could go back to the girl I was. I wish I could just look at her and say, you're beautiful, and nobody needs to tell you that. I wish I had the strength to walk away. And then, of course, he came back telling me get in the car. So I got back in the car. I was scared, you know, and then that became a way of life. He would lose his temper. He would grab the back of my hair or grab my neck and shove me into the wall. He had a temper that would flare at a blink of an eye, you know, and no rhyme or reason, you know, nothing that you could do to prevent it. And I think I had so much trauma as a child, I just kind of accepted it. Even though my relationship with Mike wasn't the best, it was the best I ever knew. People that haven't been physically and emotionally abused in their childhood have a very hard, it's very hard for them to relate to those of us that have. So again, as abusive as it was better than what I was used to. A friend of ours invited us to a Halloween party. And we went, and we were all dressed up and having a great time. And obviously I'm talking to people and I'm in the moment. And I had noticed that Mike was gone. And then I started asking people, hey, have you seen Mike? And nobody did. And he was gone a good hour. And when I finally did find him, I think all I said was, hey, I've been looking for you. You know, and all of a sudden, the mood with him changed. And there was this refrigerator that was there, and he started punching it. And like all this rage out of nowhere. I mean, it was like he was fighting somebody. I mean, total, complete rage, you know, and leaving indentations in this fridge. It was horrible. And I was like, what is going on? And I remember he stopped punching the refrigerator and he started punching me. What did I do to deserve this? It's not about love. More like I was his possession, and he needed something in his life that he can control. Nobody knew what to do. Again, we're kids. It's not like you think now where you shield somebody. And I kept thinking, I don't want to do this. And I needed to leave. And then I found out I was pregnant. I was dating Mike for about 1.5 years when I found out I was pregnant. So I was about 17. He just kept saying, I want to marry you. And I just kept saying, no, I'm good. I might be pregnant, but I don't want to get married. I knew that this isn't the life I wanted to be in. This isn't the life I wanted for my kids. I was petrified. My parents and his parents emphasized that if I didn't get married, that God would be upset with me and I would go to hell. And I truly didn't want to offend God in any shape or form. And I didn't want to be condemned to hell for eternity. You know, who would? Mike and I were going to my parents' home, and somebody had cut Mike off. and he grabbed a hammer and went over to the guy that was driving and screaming and yelling and waving this hammer, you know, and telling him he was going to kill him. And I was horrified. You know, I thought he was going to drag him out of the car and use that hammer on him. And then he was going to bash his skull in. And the man had the common sense to leave that immediate area. And then he just got in the car and nothing was ever said after it. He would go into these rages and then just snap out of them. He could switch it on and off like a light bulb. You know, and your adrenaline's still going, your fear's still going. Not only was I in fear for that man's life, but I was in fear for my life too, because, you know, I knew what he was capable of. The wedding wasn't for me, the wedding was for them. It wasn't a happy event. First off, I was pregnant, and everybody knew I was pregnant. And after the event, he was counting some envelopes, and I went to open up one of the envelopes and asked how much we had, and I don't know what trigger I hit. And he grabbed me by the back of the head, threw me into the closet, and started beating me, and I went into a fetal position. And all he did was start kicking my back and my spine. And all I could do was try and deflect it. So my wedding was not a beautiful thing. And I knew it wasn't going to get any better from here. Mike had fish tanks throughout the house. And we had come home and there was a fish out of the tank. And he was enraged. And I had a kitten at that time. And whether the fish jumped out of the tank and died or the kitten got it, I don't know. But his rage was focused on that kitten, and he beat it to death. I was horrified. What could I do to stop it? Absolutely nothing. I think somehow I was responsible for the kitten that he felt killed his fish, so I was going to have to suffer and watch the brutality of it. That's what I think. I was absolutely terrified of him after that. I knew in that moment that he was capable of killing me. This is a picture of all the generations of the Edwin Bernard Caprats. It's a picture of my ex-husband with my oldest son as an infant, his grandfather and his father. And I actually look at this picture and Mike looks happy. He looks proud. He looks like a proud father. He looks hopeful, optimistic for the future. That's the person that I fell in love with, not the person that he became. And I would like to put this down. Sometimes I would wake up and the man would be gone. Like, I have no idea where he went. You know what I mean? You know, like, are you in the bathroom? So you walk around and, no, he's not here. No, the vehicle's not here. And I never once asked him where he was because he wasn't one to take for questioning. You know, like, it kind of was like, I'm gonna do what I wanna do when I do it. And you're just gonna have to deal with it. But I did notice a box that I never saw before, and it had all sorts of miscellaneous items, like a watch in there, foreign money, foreign coins. Where did this come from? He probably was breaking into people's homes and stealing items. That's what occurs to me. But one time, when he came home early morning, his knuckles were swollen, and he had not welts, but red marks on the side of his face and on the side of his neck. And I did question him on that, and he told me, none of your business. You know, that was the finality of it. The one time, he was gone for maybe 2 months. Not a phone call, nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a relief. I didn't want him back at that point. And I remember the boys were sleeping, and I went in to take a shower, and I came out, and standing in my living room is Mike. And the first thing I said are, where are my kids? And he said, they're in the car. And he said, I'm coming home. And I said, oh, no, you're not. And he said, before you say anything else, he said, understand, if you don't allow me back here to live, he said, I'm going to take both the boys, and he said, and I'm going to kill them before you can even pick up a phone to call the cops. So people ask, why did you stay? I tried so many times to get out. We went from living in our apartment in New Jersey to all of a sudden, we're gonna move to Florida. None of it made sense. Why are we going to Florida? You know what I mean? You know, was there a certain incident? I don't know the answer. It was right before Christmas. We moved in with his parents, and it wasn't good. At that time, he wasn't working, and I was barely working. And at Christmas time, he went up to the attic and came down with everything my children wanted for Christmas. You know, Nintendos, I believe there was one each, video games, things that were beyond his financial capabilities. You know, like, where is this from? Don't worry about it, none of your business, was what I was told. I thought it was very odd. Because of my childhood, I was overly protective of my children. I did everything for my kids. I lived for my kids. I took beatings for my kids. He always used the children as a weapon. The way that he could continue giving me emotional pain was by raising his voice to them, by grabbing their arms, by shaking them. I took so many beatings by overstepping my bounds, by telling him not to touch them that way, by not to scream at them. You know, again, it was a way of life. It's amazing sometimes you don't stand up for yourself as much as you should, but you stand up for other people. I bought my ex-husband a big old bottle of Jack Daniels. I got him good and drunk, and I knocked on the door. I introduced myself. I told him I need to go in there and get my kids and my cats. And he said, absolutely, I'll go to the house with you. And I remember walking through that front door, deputies behind me. He says, you go in there, and he says, and I'm not leaving till you retrieve your kids, get them safely in the car, and that's what I did. I wanted to leave from the day I got married. I remember being in that car and thinking that this is something I didn't want to have as a permanent part of my life, and I wanted something better. I guess a moment of clarity, a God moment, a universe moment, I don't really know. But I know that was the day. I didn't feel that sense of freedom until hours later when I realized nobody was following me. I was in New Jersey, and I was at my parents' house. I remember thinking, I can do this. I had a job that took care of my kids. I remember thinking, am I really free? I felt safe. Until I opened that door. And it was just standing there. He had showed up out of the blue, like no phone call ahead of time, just like you hear the doorbell and you open up the door and he's there. He told me how much he loved me and he missed the kids. And my parents had this, that's your husband sort of attitude, so he can come and see his children anytime he wants. And he walked in the house and never left. So there wasn't much I could do about it because I was not in my own home. He just moved in like he owned me again. I felt trapped. I felt like, what the hell am I gonna do? And how do I get away from this now? Because I have nowhere to go. Two detectives from Florida had come to my parents' home and asked to speak to Mike. And at that time, I knew nothing. And they didn't just speak to him. At that time, they put him in a car and that was it. I had asked, you know, what's going on? And that's when I was informed that he is being extradited back to Florida and placed under arrest for murder. That the man was bludgeoned to death. And that Mike was caught using his credit cards, and that's how they traced it back to him. After the fact, I put 2 and 2 together to realize that man lost his life to get my children presents. That's horrific. The system sucks. I truly did believe that he had killed this man. I filed for a divorce. And right before I left him, he grabbed my elbow and dragged me into a room and raped me. Very hard. The last time that I had seen my ex-husband was when I was leaving the courthouse. Mike had come up to me and grabbed my arm. And his words to me were, "I don't care about the kids. I only care about you. And that you need to come to Florida. And that's what I want, and that's what you're gonna do." And as he's talking to me, his hold on my arm is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And all I knew is there was a snowball's chance in hell that I'd ever go back to Florida with them. I fought too hard to get out. I heard that apparently he had gotten arrested at one point in time, and he was an informant to have his freedom. He was a rat. He was a coward, a bully, and a rat. He had no idea that I knew. I told him he over some pretty big cats, and I gave him some names, which I'm not going to share here. And I said, if I don't get to where I'm supposed to be at 5 o'clock, rest assured, there are 3 envelopes that are getting mailed. It felt good to make a stand and take my power back. And he didn't say a word. He just released my arm, and that's the last time I ever saw the man. I heard that he was arrested, and he was a suspect in multiple killings. I knew he was a monster. He's labeled a serial killer now. I think it was shock. I think it was traumatic. It was trauma. And then I was told that he targeted elderly women, which I think about, and I thought about the horror that I went through him, and then I thought about the horror that they went through. To me, it looked like the perfect victim because they can't fight back. I really think it was because it made him feel powerful.
So this is a page from Hernando County Sheriff's Office. You know, they didn't put a transcript of his confession, but they described it.
I hope I don't have to read this out loud.
You can make me do it if you want.
It's much easier because it's very emotional.
In Caprat's own words, he stated, "I'm a sick individual. I broke in, found the people, did what I did. They were sexually assaulted and then they were killed." He stated he confronted the victim and struck her several times. He admitted that he made the victim have vaginal intercourse with him and then made her perform oral sex on him. He states the victim did resist and that at one point while he was on top of her, she appeared as though she was having a heart attack. So he, in turn, stepped on her throat to put her out of her misery.
My whole body is shaking. Lydia M. Rydell was 79 years old. Lydia Rydell was active in her church. Neighbors remember her as caring and helpful, someone who often looked out for others. What a beautiful soul. Some beautiful person lost their life for no reason. None of this should have ever happened. She should have died of old age in the arms of her family. William and Alice Whitney. William was brutally beaten and later died of pneumonia from his injuries. Alice, who has Alzheimer's disease, was also assaulted but survived the attack, living with the trauma for the remainder of her life. I can only imagine growing old with the person that you love and trying to save your wife. And I couldn't even imagine what they felt during it, what they felt after it. Alice Dahl, it was 87 years old. Alice Dahl was found dead in her Spring Hill home, which had been set on fire. The 87-year-old had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Dahl, a one-time speed skater, an athlete, fought hard. I'm sure she did. Good for her. Her bloody dentures were found near her body. She had bitten the assailant in the back.
That was the last victim, the one that got him caught.
Good. I mean, it's not good that any of this happened, but it's good that somebody finally connected all the dots and put the pieces together. It's an atrocity. And if that wasn't horrific enough, I think the thing that hit home to me was when I had read articles that the victims, they were sexually assaulted. Essentially, it gave him a euphoria and a sense of power when he assaulted them in that manner. And that's very hard for me to talk about. I know towards the end, sex became very violent.
He was violent with you during sex?
Yes. It was choking. It was restraining. It was demeaning. And I still to this day believe that everybody that he killed, he thought he was killing me. And because he lost control. Because he couldn't control me anymore. I had a friend of mine that I was discussing this with. My friend had asked him, "Hey man, where you been? We've been looking for you." And he said, "I just killed somebody," and smiled. And the person that told me was very freaked out about it. And he was like, "Do you think he did?" And I said, "I have no idea." I said, "None of us know where he went." Now that I reflect back on it, I feel like it could have been possible. It's surreal. I don't know all the people that he killed. I honestly don't know. Where is the line that the only thing that brings you joy is extreme violence and cruelty? I have looked at this picture many times. And at first it was hard for me to meet his eyes in it. All I feel in this picture is suppressed underlying rage because he had gotten caught. I don't identify with who this person is. I mean, before I left him, he was becoming this person, but he wasn't wholly this person at this point in time. It doesn't even look like the same person. I don't know what makes people capable of killing another human being. But I really believe, and especially after looking at those pictures, the only thing that made him feel anything was committing these murders. I have no remorse for him being dead. I feel like death was too easy on him. I would have rather seen him spend his life in prison and be brutally sodomized by not one but many people. I would have liked him to be in fear for his life of every one of his days. I would have liked everything that he did to me and to these people. I would have liked to have him relive it every day. I feel like he got off too easy. I do. I think he got off easy. But that's the truth. That's how I feel. I wouldn't be the person I am today if this didn't happen the way that it did. It made me stronger. It made me live my life with no regrets. It made me recognize who the true people in my life were. And there is hope. And there is more to life than dysfunction. You know, I'm alive to tell my story. You know. And in some odd way, I am thankful for this experience, as painful as it is, because it's helping me heal. And that's what I want for all people that have suffered abuse, is healing and to be better and beautiful.
I hate him. The sight of him makes me sick. I think Wesley put him in the closet and left him. I don't know how they felt, but I think about it all the time. I chose this man to be my husband, and that's a hard pill to swallow.
There is a profound and unspoken contract that exists between a society and the individuals who are sworn to protect it. In most parts of the world, this contract is enforced by the presence of a firearm resting quietly but visibly on the hip of a patrol officer. The weapon serves as a deterrent, a silent promise of ultimate consequence should the boundaries of law and order be violently breached. However, there are rare places on this earth where the fabric of the community is woven so tightly and the respect for authority is so deeply ingrained that law enforcement operates without the need for such lethal deterrence. For decades, the United States territory of American Samoa was one of these unique sanctuaries. It was a jurisdiction where the uniform alone commanded respect, where the presence of an officer was deemed sufficient to defuse a conflict, and where the patrol units walked their beats completely unarmed. The police force relied on their physical presence, their deep community ties, and the inherent respect for the law to maintain the peace. It was a system built on profound mutual trust, a collective belief that the ultimate escalation of violence was something that happened elsewhere, far across the ocean, but never on their shores. This fundamental belief, this deeply held conviction about the safety of their island and the invulnerability of their unarmed guardians, was irrevocably shattered on a seemingly ordinary Thursday morning. The date was July 22, 2010. The location was the Fagatogo High Court, the absolute epicenter of judicial authority in the territory. What unfolded on the grounds of this courthouse would become recorded as one of the darkest, most shocking, and profoundly devastating events in the modern history of American Samoa. It was an event that did not just take a life. It fundamentally altered the innocence of an entire island, forever erasing the era of the unarmed patrol officer and forcing a community to confront a level of brutality it had never anticipated. To understand the sheer magnitude of the horror that occurred shortly after 11 o'clock that morning, it is essential to first understand the deeply entrenched, simmering tensions that had been steadily building in the shadows of this small community. Crimes of this magnitude, particularly those directed at the very heart of the justice system, rarely occur in a vacuum. They are almost always the culmination of a long, slow burn of resentment, a toxic accumulation of perceived grievances, and an escalating pattern of defiance. In this specific case, the epicenter of this mounting pressure was the complex and increasingly hostile relationship between local law enforcement and a specific group within the community, the Siamo family. The Siamo family was not an obscure or unknown entity on the island. They were a prominent family, widely recognized within the local social structure. However, this prominence was cast under a heavy and persistent shadow due to a recurring pattern of severe legal entanglements. Over a sustained period, various members of the family found themselves frequently at odds with the law, navigating a revolving door of police investigations, intense legal scrutiny, and courtroom appearances. For the local police department, dealing with the Siamo family had become a persistent, exhausting, and highly challenging aspect of their duties. Every interaction, every investigation, and every legal proceeding added another layer of friction to an already strained dynamic. It was not merely a matter of isolated incidents, it was a compounding history of mutual wariness. The police viewed the family's recurring legal troubles as a persistent challenge to the rule of law and the safety of the community, while within the family, a deep-seated and incredibly dangerous resentment toward the police was taking root. This animosity was not passive, it was an active, festering hatred that had been carefully cultivated over years of what they likely perceived as relentless harassment and targeted scrutiny by the authorities. The law enforcement officers, simply doing their sworn jobs to maintain order and investigate potential crimes, unknowingly became the focal point of a dangerously concentrated, localized rage. This historical backdrop of continuous conflict and simmering hostility perfectly set the stage for the specific legal proceedings that took place on the morning of July 22nd. The Fagatogo High Court, a building that stands as the ultimate symbol of resolution, fairness, and justice, was tasked with hearing a case that perfectly encapsulated the ongoing friction between the authorities and the family. A member of the Siamo family was standing trial, facing serious criminal charges related to the illegal possession of weapons. The nature of the charge itself is a highly critical detail that cannot be overlooked. In a territory where even the police officers patrolling the streets are not equipped with firearms, a civilian facing formal charges for the illegal possession of weapons carries a particularly heavy and ominous weight. It speaks to an underlying undercurrent of danger, a blatant disregard for the established norms of safety and order that the community held dear. The trial had undoubtedly been the subject of intense focus throughout the island, acting as a focal point for the anxieties and the deep-seated animosity that defined the relationship between the two factions. As the proceedings commenced that morning, the atmosphere within the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The legal machinery was fully in motion, meticulously analyzing evidence, hearing testimonies, and ultimately moving toward a definitive resolution. Finally, the presiding judge delivered the verdict. The family member was acquitted of all charges related to the illegal weapons possession. The gavel fell, and in the strict eyes of the law, the defendant was entirely cleared. In the standard, logical architecture of the justice system, an acquittal is explicitly designed to be the definitive end of a conflict. It is supposed to be the moment the pressure valve is released, a time when the accused is legally vindicated and the immediate tension surrounding the trial permanently dissipates. It is a moment for taking a collective breath, stepping out of the courthouse, and returning to the quiet, predictable rhythms of normal daily life. However, human psychology, especially when heavily warped by years of accumulated hatred and deeply ingrained resentment, does not always follow the logical path laid out by the legal system. In a tragic and terrifying paradox, the acquittal delivered by the Fagatogo High Court that morning did not extinguish the flames of conflict. Instead, it acted as a highly combustible and devastating catalyst. The ruling did not bring peace. It did not bring relief or a sense of closure. Instead, it somehow validated and massively magnified the intense agitation burning within a man named Siamo Jr. Siamo Jr., who was 33 years old at the time, was present to witness the culmination of the trial. One might reasonably expect that seeing a family member walk free, successfully beating a highly serious weapons charge, would be a moment of immense triumph and emotional de-escalation. But for Siamo Jr., the verdict appeared to have the exact opposite effect. The years of accumulated grudges, the perceived systemic slights, the countless police investigations targeting his family, and the heavy emotional burden of continuous legal battles had created a volatile psychological pressure cooker within him. The acquittal did not release this extreme pressure. It inexplicably pushed his agitation far past the point of no return. The exact internal mechanism of his mind in those crucial moments remains a dark and deeply disturbing mystery, a focal point of the extensive legal and psychological battles that would consume the territory's courts for years to come. What is unequivocally clear from the factual record, however, is that as the court adjourned and the legal proceedings officially concluded shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning, Siamo Jr. was not preparing to celebrate a legal victory with his relatives. He was silently and methodically preparing to execute an act of unprecedented and unfathomable violence against the very institution that had just cleared his family member. The transition from the structured, orderly environment of the courtroom to the open air of the courthouse exterior marked the absolute beginning of a localized nightmare. Inside the heavy walls of the building, the law had spoken, and a peaceful resolution had theoretically been achieved. Outside, however, the real world was entirely unprepared for the violent rebellion that was about to unfold against the very concept of that law. As the clock ticked past 11, the personnel of the High Court, the meticulous clerks, the dedicated legal professionals, and the citizens who had attended the morning sessions began to slowly filter out of the building. They moved through the heavy main doors and stepped out into the warm tropical morning air, their minds likely transitioning from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the legal proceedings to the mundane tasks of the day ahead. Among those exiting the building and positioning themselves in the immediate vicinity were the police officers assigned to courthouse security. Their presence was a standard procedural requirement, a visual representation of absolute authority and order meant to simply ensure the safe and orderly dispersal of the morning crowd. They were conducting their duties exactly as they had done countless times before, standing watch over the premises, managing the gentle flow of people, and providing a reassuring, though completely unarmed, physical presence. They had absolutely no reason to suspect that this particular Thursday would be any different from the thousands of tranquil days that preceded it. They were entirely unaware that the deep-seated animosity they had successfully managed and mitigated for years had just mutated into something lethally proactive and unstoppable. The officers, relying completely on the historical safety of their isolated island and the protective, psychological weight of their dark uniforms, stood in the designated areas outside the court, completely vulnerable and entirely defenseless against a ballistic threat. They were dedicated peacekeepers in a land that had momentarily forgotten the grim necessity of preparing for war. An unarmed officer relies entirely on the societal agreement that the badge is a shield. When an individual decides that the law means absolutely nothing, the officer is left with nothing but cloth to stop a bullet. It was at this precise, terrifying juncture as the peaceful routine of the courthouse exterior was unfolding under the mid-morning sun, that the physical manifestation of Siamo Jr.'s accumulated rage finally arrived on the scene. The immediate setting was the designated parking area situated directly in front of the Fagatogo High Court, a space typically reserved strictly for official vehicles and authorized governmental personnel. The visual of the High Court itself, an imposing structure representing the highest tier of justice and societal order, stood as a silent, majestic witness to the approaching chaos. The sheer audacity of what was about to happen is heavily amplified by the location itself. To launch an attack here is not merely to attack an individual officer, it is to launch a direct, calculated, and devastating strike against the very institution of justice and the foundational societal order it represents. Into this quiet scene of administrative routine and unguarded vulnerability, a white pickup truck suddenly appeared. It was driven directly by Siamo Jr. The vehicle did not approach with any caution or respect for the established boundaries of the courthouse grounds. Instead, it moved with highly aggressive, deliberate intent, tearing through the invisible protocols of the sacred space. The white pickup truck aggressively breached the restricted zone directly in front of the High Court's main gates, an area clearly demarcated and legally protected from all unauthorized civilian access. The sudden, violent intrusion of the vehicle into this forbidden space was the first tangible fracture in the absolute peace of the morning, a jarring visual disruption that immediately commanded the full attention of the unarmed security detail. The truck came to a sudden, aggressive halt, its very presence an immediate and blatant challenge to the authority of the officers standing watch. The officers, recognizing the clear violation of the restricted zone, would naturally direct their attention toward the vehicle, preparing to address the infraction through standard, unarmed verbal communication. The stage was now completely set for a catastrophic collision that the territory of American Samoa was entirely unequipped to handle. The long history of friction, the heavy accumulation of grudges, the deeply paradoxical agitation following an acquittal, and the absolute, tragic vulnerability of an unarmed police force were all rapidly converging on this single, fatal point in time. As the engine of the white pickup truck idled loudly in the restricted zone and the heavy courthouse doors continued to let out the morning's attendees, the small island territory was mere seconds away from a violent awakening that would permanently scar its history and change its laws forever. The doors of the white pickup truck were about to open, and with them, an unprecedented storm of violence was about to be unleashed upon the unarmed guardians of Fagatogo. To truly comprehend the sheer gravity of the loss suffered on that July morning, one must first look deeply into the life and legacy of the man who stood on the front line of this unimaginable tragedy. In a sprawling metropolis, a police officer might be a passing figure, an anonymous badge in a sea of faces, but on a remote island territory in the South Pacific, the dynamics of law enforcement are fundamentally different. Here, an officer is deeply interwoven into the very fabric of the community. They are neighbors, relatives, and lifelong acquaintances. Among this tight-knit brotherhood of peacekeepers, Lieutenant Lucilla Brown was an absolute paragon of dedication and duty. By the year 2010, Lieutenant Brown had dedicated 19 years of his life to the uniform, a profound tenure that spoke volumes about his character and his unwavering commitment to the people of American Samoa. 19 years is not merely a measurement of time, it is an entire era of service. It represents nearly 2 decades of mediating disputes, protecting the vulnerable, and upholding the fragile balance of law and order without the reliance on a holstered weapon. In a jurisdiction where patrol officers walked their beats completely unarmed, authority was not derived from the threat of lethal force, but rather from an immense reservoir of personal respect, diplomatic skill, and deep community ties. Lieutenant Brown was a master of this unique brand of policing. He commanded respect not through fear, but through a consistent, daily demonstration of fairness and integrity. He was known universally as a model officer, a man whose reputation preceded him in every village and neighborhood he patrolled. When Lieutenant Brown arrived at the scene of a disturbance, The situation often de-escalated simply because of his calming presence and the heavy weight of his 19 years of earned authority. The profound impact of his life extended far beyond the confines of the police precinct. Within the intimate society of American Samoa, Lieutenant Brown was celebrated as the fundamental pillar of a large, extended family. In this culture, family is the absolute core of existence, and to be the pillar of such a structure requires an immense capacity for love, responsibility, and unwavering strength. He was the provider, the protector, and the guiding force for those who loved him. Every time he donned his uniform and stepped out into the tropical morning, he carried the weight of his family's love and the community's trust on his shoulders. He represented the absolute best of what the territory's law enforcement aspired to be, deeply connected to the people, fundamentally fair, and courageously unarmed in the face of potential danger. His 19 years on the force meant that he had seen a generation grow up. He knew the faces, the histories, and the complex interconnected relationships that define the island. He understood that policing here was not about imposing will from above, but about maintaining harmony from within. This profound understanding made him not just a law enforcement officer, but a vital societal anchor. He was a man who believed implicitly in the inherent goodness of his community, operating daily on the deeply held belief that mutual respect would always serve as an impenetrable shield against ultimate violence. He embodied the innocence of an era in American Samoa policing that was entirely reliant on the sanctity of human connection. In sharp and devastating contrast to the life of public service and community building exemplified by Lieutenant Brown stood the complex and troubled history of the Siamo family. To understand the brewing storm that would eventually consume the Fagatogo High Court, it is absolutely critical to examine the deep-seated tensions that characterized the relationship between this prominent local family and the territorial police force. The Siamo name was well known across the island, carrying with it a significant degree of local prominence. However, this prominence was increasingly overshadowed by a dark and recurring pattern of legal entanglements. The family frequently found itself operating on the very edge of the law, entangled in a complex web of police investigations, criminal allegations, and hostile courtroom confrontations. This was not a matter of a single misunderstanding or an isolated incident. It was a chronic, deeply entrenched conflict that had festered over many years. For the police officers tasked with maintaining order, the Siamo family represented a perpetual challenge, a localized epicenter of disruption that required constant monitoring and intervention. Every encounter between the police and members of the family was heavily loaded with the baggage of past conflicts. The officers were simply executing their sworn duties, investigating potential criminal activity, and attempting to enforce the law in a community that desperately relied on their protection. But from the perspective of the Siamo family, these legitimate law enforcement actions were likely viewed through a distorted lens of persecution and targeted harassment. A deep, toxic resentment began to take root and multiply within the family, an active and malignant hatred directed squarely at the uniform and the individuals who wore it. This simmering hostility was a dangerously open secret on the island. The police, including veteran officers like Lieutenant Brown, were acutely aware of the friction. They knew that interacting with the Siamo family required a heightened level of vigilance and an abundance of caution, even within an unarmed force. Yet, they continued to perform their duties, relying on the established boundaries of the judicial system to handle the transgressions. They trusted that the courts, the ultimate arbiters of justice, would resolve the disputes and hold the line against lawlessness. They never could have anticipated that the family's deeply harbored resentment would eventually bypass the courtroom entirely and manifest in a display of raw, unprecedented carnage. The animosity had grown beyond a mere dislike for authority. It had evolved into a dangerous, volatile energy looking for an outlet. The constant cycle of arrests, investigations, and legal battles served as a continuous accelerant to this burning anger. It was an environment perfectly primed for a catastrophic failure of the social contract. The island's unique dynamic, where the police and the citizens shared the same small geographical space and interacted constantly, meant that there was no physical or psychological distance between the enforcers of the law and those who consistently defied it. This unbearable tension finally found its focal point in a specific, highly serious legal proceeding that culminated on the morning of July 22, 2010. The Fagatogo High Court was the venue for a trial that perfectly crystallized the ongoing war of attrition between the authorities and the family. A member of the Siamo family was facing intense scrutiny and formal criminal charges related to the illegal possession of weapons. In any jurisdiction, a weapons charge is a matter of profound concern, but in the context of American Samoa, where the patrol officers themselves do not carry firearms, the presence of illegal weaponry in the hands of a civilian is an existential threat to the entire community. It represents a terrifying escalation, a willingness to introduce lethal force into an environment specifically designed to operate without it. The trial was the culmination of meticulous police work, an effort to neutralize a severe threat and enforce the boundaries of public safety. For the police department, securing a conviction in this case was likely viewed as a crucial step in reasserting the rule of law. For the Siamo family, however, the trial was yet another battleground, another perceived attack by a system they deeply despised. The courtroom was thick with a palpable, almost suffocating tension as the evidence was presented and the legal arguments were fiercely debated. Every word spoken in that room carried the immense weight of the years of history leading up to this moment. When the trial finally concluded and the presiding judge delivered the verdict, the outcome was a profound shock to the system. The family member was acquitted. The charges of illegal weapons possession were dismissed, and the defendant was legally cleared. In the sterile, objective eyes of the judicial system, the matter was definitively closed. It should have been a moment of de-escalation, a definitive end to this specific chapter of conflict. It should have signaled a return to normalcy. But the human mind, especially when poisoned by years of cultivated hatred and a distorted sense of reality, is not a sterile or objective environment. For Siamo Jr., a 33-year-old man completely consumed by the family's narrative of persecution and resentment, the acquittal did not bring peace. It did not provide a sense of relief or a desire to move forward. Instead, the verdict acted as a massive, incomprehensible psychological trigger. The reasons why an acquittal would ignite such a violent reaction remain buried deep within the dark architecture of his mind. Perhaps he viewed the trial itself as an unforgivable insult, a systemic attack that demanded retribution regardless of the outcome. Perhaps the years of built-up pressure simply could not be contained any longer, and the conclusion of the trial was merely the spark that finally breached the containment vessel of his rage. While the legal system had officially declared peace inside the courtroom, Siamo Jr. was actively preparing for a massacre outside its doors. The juxtaposition between the orderly, rule-bound environment of the Fagatogo High Court and the chaotic, lawless violence brewing in the mind of this one man is the central tragedy of this narrative. As the morning sun beat down on the historic courthouse, two entirely different worlds were preparing to collide. On one side was Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, a man who had dedicated 19 years of his life to maintaining peace through respect and unarmed courage, a beloved father and a paragon of his community. He was standing on the courthouse grounds, performing his standard security duties, his mind completely clear of malice, trusting implicitly in the protective power of his uniform and the sanctity of the institution he guarded. On the other side was Siamo Jr., an individual whose mind had become entirely divorced from reason, armed with a fully loaded 9mm handgun and driven by an insatiable, blinding hatred. He was sitting behind the wheel of a white pickup truck, transforming the vehicle into a weapon of access, prepared to shatter the innocence of his island forever. The stage was irrevocably set. The history of conflict had reached its boiling point. The unarmed guardians of American Samoa were standing directly in the path of an unprecedented storm, entirely unaware that the darkest hour in the history of their peaceful territory had finally arrived. The heavy wooden doors of the Fagatogo High Court swung open shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning, releasing a stream of legal professionals, citizens, and family members into the bright, suffocating tropical heat of the South Pacific. Inside those thick, imposing walls, the mechanisms of the justice system had just completed their work, culminating in the acquittal of a member of the Siamo family on highly severe weapons charges. To any rational observer standing outside on the sunlit pavement, the conclusion of such a tense and highly scrutinized trial should have naturally signaled a profound de-escalation of hostilities. The immediate atmosphere surrounding the courthouse should have been one of gradual relaxation, a collective exhalation following days of intense legal maneuvering and community anxiety. People were descending the steps, their minds already transitioning from the rigid formalities of the judicial proceedings to the mundane realities of their daily lives. Positioned strategically around the exterior of the building, specifically near the designated entrance and the immediate parking areas, were the officers of the American Samoa Police Force. They were entirely unarmed, their authority completely derived from the dark fabric of their uniforms, the gleaming silver of their badges, and the deep, unspoken respect they had cultivated within the community over many years. Among them stood Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, a deeply revered 19-year veteran of the force. He was a man who had dedicated nearly 2 decades to mastering the delicate art of unarmed peacekeeping, relying on his formidable presence, his calm demeanor, and his extensive network of personal relationships to resolve conflicts and maintain the fragile tranquility of the island. On this particular Thursday morning, his posture was undoubtedly relaxed, his attention gently sweeping the dispersing crowd, completely unaware that the familiar, peaceful surroundings of his lifelong home were about to transform into a landscape of unimaginable and unprecedented carnage. The absolute tranquility of the morning was shattered not by a gradual escalation of shouting or a sudden physical altercation, but by the aggressive, mechanical roar of an approaching vehicle. A white pickup truck, driven with a terrifying and deeply purposeful intensity, violently breached the perimeter of the courthouse exterior. It did not slow down to navigate the standard flow of traffic, nor did it attempt to find a legitimate space in the public areas. Instead, the vehicle was steered deliberately and forcefully into the strictly prohibited, highly restricted zone located directly in front of the High Court gates. This area was explicitly reserved for the highest level of official government vehicles and authorized judicial personnel, serving as a vital physical buffer between the public space and the sacred institution of justice. The sudden, jarring intrusion of the white truck into this forbidden space was an immediate and glaring violation of the established order, a blatant, physical challenge to the authority of the officers standing watch. For Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues, the sudden arrival of the vehicle would have instantly triggered a professional response. Their training, firmly rooted in the philosophy of unarmed de-escalation, would dictate that they approach the vehicle calmly, assess the intent of the driver, and address the blatant parking violation through verbal communication and authoritative instruction. They began to turn their attention toward the idling white truck, fully expecting to confront a disgruntled citizen or perhaps a confused driver, their minds completely closed to the horrific reality of the threat that was currently sitting behind the steering wheel. The driver's side door of the white pickup truck was forcefully thrown open, and Siamo Jr. stepped out onto the hot asphalt. He was 33 years old, physically imposing, and entirely consumed by a toxic, blinding rage that had entirely severed his connection to reason and humanity. The deep-seated animosity that his family had harbored toward the police, exponentially magnified by the paradoxical psychological trigger of the morning's acquittal, had finally pushed him past the point of no return. As he emerged from the vehicle, the sheer, paralyzing horror of the situation was instantly revealed. Gripped firmly in his hand was a loaded 9mm handgun. The visual manifestation of this weapon in the bright morning sunlight was an impossible, cognitive shock to the unarmed officers and the innocent bystanders. In American Samoa, a jurisdiction where the police themselves patrolled the streets with nothing more than radios and handcuffs, the sudden appearance of a lethal firearm in a public space was not just highly unusual, it was a catastrophic anomaly. It was the introduction of an absolute, lethal advantage into an environment that was fundamentally unequipped to counter it. The officers, who were trained to utilize the weight of the law to command compliance, suddenly found themselves staring down the dark, hollow barrel of a weapon that recognized no authority and respected no badge. In that microscopic fraction of a second, the entire operational paradigm of the territorial police force completely collapsed. They were no longer the authoritative guardians of the peace. They were entirely defenseless targets trapped in an open space with a heavily armed and utterly ruthless aggressor. Siamo Jr. did not hesitate. He did not issue any demands, he did not shout any warnings, and he made absolutely no attempt to articulate his deeply distorted grievances. His actions were cold, calculated, and terrifyingly direct. With the 9mm handgun raised, he began to advance aggressively toward the cluster of police officers tasked with securing the courthouse. His gaze locked onto Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. Why he chose the 19-year veteran as his first target remains a chilling detail of the tragedy. Perhaps it was proximity, perhaps it was the lieutenant's rank and the immense respect he commanded, making him the ultimate symbol of the authority Siamo despised. Whatever the twisted logic operating in the shooter's mind, the outcome was brutally absolute. Closing the distance with terrifying speed, Siamo raised the weapon and opened fire at point-blank range. The explosive, concussive sounds of the 9mm gunshots ripped through the peaceful, tropical air, bouncing violently off the heavy stone and concrete facades of the Fagatogo High Court. The noise was deafening, a completely alien sound in a community entirely unaccustomed to the devastating acoustics of urban warfare. At such close range, there was absolutely no opportunity for the veteran officer to react, to seek cover, or to attempt any form of physical defense. Lieutenant Brown was struck directly and catastrophically in his vital organs. The sheer physical force and the devastating internal damage caused by the projectiles were completely overwhelming. The deeply respected 19-year pillar of the community, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the people of American Samoa without ever needing to draw a weapon, immediately collapsed onto the unforgiving concrete. The immediate aftermath of the fatal shots was a scene of absolute, paralyzing pandemonium. The Fagatogo High Court exterior, previously a space of orderly dispersal, instantly devolved into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare. The heavy, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder rapidly flooded the humid air, providing a grim, sensory confirmation of the violence that had just occurred. Innocent bystanders, court clerks, and civilians who had been peacefully exiting the building were suddenly plunged into an active shooter scenario for which they had absolutely zero preparation. Pure, unadulterated panic swept through the crowd as people desperately scrambled for any available cover, diving behind parked vehicles, throwing themselves onto the ground, or frantically running back toward the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse. Screams of terror and utter disbelief mingled with the terrifying, echoing cracks of continuing gunfire. Siamo Jr., having just executed a revered police lieutenant, did not stop his violent rampage. Fueled by an incomprehensible adrenaline and an absolute disregard for human life, he wildly continued to discharge the 9mm weapon. He stood over the fallen officer, an untouchable agent of chaos, wildly waving the firearm and indiscriminately targeting the remaining symbols of law enforcement desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the slaughter unfolding before their eyes. In the face of this overwhelming, heavily armed onslaught, the reaction of the surviving police personnel was an astonishing display of raw, completely suicidal courage. They were entirely devoid of firearms, possessing absolutely no ballistic vests, no protective shields, and no means of returning lethal fire. Every instinct of human preservation would violently scream at them to flee the immediate area, to find hard cover, and to wait for a heavily armed tactical unit that simply did not exist on their peaceful island. Yet, fully witnessing the brutal assassination of their veteran colleague, several officers made the conscious, deeply heroic decision to charge directly into the line of fire. Among them were the territory's Homeland Security Director and a dedicated police detective. Recognizing that allowing the shooter to continue his rampage would result in a massive, uncontrolled loss of civilian life, these men completely abandoned their own safety. They sprinted across the open, exposed asphalt, directly toward a man wildly discharging a 9mm handgun. They had nothing but their bare hands and an unbreakable, desperate resolve to stop the massacre. As they closed the critical distance, attempting the impossible task of physically disarming a profoundly agitated shooter, they too were caught in the devastating hail of gunfire. The Homeland Security Director and the detective were both struck by the lethal projectiles, sustaining incredibly severe and traumatic physical injuries that would require massive emergency surgical interventions and months of painful, agonizing physical rehabilitation. They were violently thrown back by the impact of the bullets, their blood staining the same concrete where Lieutenant Brown already lay dying. Despite the horrifying injuries inflicted upon the officers, the sheer, overwhelming momentum of the desperate law enforcement response ultimately overwhelmed the shooter. The desperate, frantic discharging of the weapon eventually ceased, either because the 9mm handgun finally exhausted its ammunition supply, leaving the slide locked back in the empty position, or because the sheer, crushing physical weight of the surrounding, uninjured officers finally managed to completely tackle the assailant to the hot ground. A violent, chaotic physical struggle ensued on the pavement as multiple officers descended upon the shooter, their adrenaline and overwhelming grief fueling their desperate efforts to pry the empty weapon from his rigid fingers and violently force his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs finally clicking securely into place around Siamo Jr.'s wrists signaled the definitive, physical end of the active massacre. He was forcefully pinned against the asphalt, completely immobilized by the men whose brothers he had just slaughtered. However, the sudden cessation of the deafening gunfire did not bring any semblance of relief to the grounds of the Fagatogo High Court. Instead, the sudden silence was rapidly replaced by a chorus of agonized cries, panicked shouts for emergency medical assistance, and the distant, approaching wails of ambulance sirens. The dark, horrific reality of what had just transpired in less than 3 minutes began to fully settle over the terrified crowd. The unquestionable sanctity of the High Court had been brutally violated. The long-standing tradition of the unarmed police force had been violently rendered obsolete, and the life of a deeply beloved 19-year veteran was rapidly slipping away on the blood-soaked pavement. The immediate aftermath of the shooting at the Fagatogo High Court was a scene of visceral, unadulterated chaos that defied the traditional, orderly procedures of the American Samoa criminal justice system. As the physical struggle to subdue Siamo Jr. finally concluded on the blood-stained asphalt, the priority shifted from active combat to the desperate, frantic preservation of life. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, the man whose 19 years of dedicated, unarmed service had come to a violent, premature end, was rushed with overwhelming urgency to the Lyndon B. Johnson Tropical Medical Center. The medical staff at the facility fought with everything in their power, but the catastrophic trauma inflicted by the point-blank gunshot wounds had proved too much for the human body to sustain. Lieutenant Brown succumbed to his injuries before the surgeons could even begin to address the extent of the damage, leaving a void that resonated through the entire island. His death was not just a professional loss for the police department. It was a profound, personal blow to the community he had so faithfully protected. Simultaneously, the two other critically injured officers, the Homeland Security Director and the detective who had heroically charged the shooter, were undergoing emergency surgical procedures to stabilize their shattered bodies. Their survival became the immediate, desperate focus of the hospital, while the secondary and arguably more complex task of investigating the massacre began at the crime scene. The investigation into the massacre was unprecedented in its scope and emotional intensity. For the investigators who arrived at the Fagatogo High Court, the scene was a grotesque tableau of shattered norms. The evidence markers placed on the ground detailed a chilling, methodical sequence of violence. Spent 9mm casings were scattered across the restricted parking zone, each one representing a moment where the thin, protective veil of island safety had been shredded. The white pickup truck, a mundane vehicle transformed into a vessel of death, stood as the central focus of the forensic sweep. Inside, Investigators hoped to find clues that might explain the internal logic of the shooter's mind. However, the investigation was quickly eclipsed by a massive, unavoidable legal and bureaucratic challenge. The immediate aftermath was defined by an overwhelming, collective demand for justice. The entire island of American Samoa, usually known for its deep-seated culture of communal forgiveness and traditional conflict resolution, was suddenly united in an unfamiliar, burning desire for the ultimate form of retribution, the death penalty. The legal proceedings that followed were immediately fraught with an intense, agonizing complexity that would define the territory's judicial landscape for the next 6 years. As the initial investigations confirmed the identity and direct participation of Sialmo Jr., the prosecutors were tasked with building a case that fit the gravity of the assassination of a police officer. It was here that the first major, historic bottleneck occurred: the issue of capital punishment. In theory, the statutes of American Samoa allowed for the imposition of the death penalty. Yet, in practice, the territory had not executed a single individual in over 60 years. The law existed as a dormant relic, entirely untested by modern judicial standards or societal expectations. The prosecutors, under immense pressure from a grieving public and a traumatized police force, moved to seek the death penalty for Sialmo. They believed that the sheer, depraved nature of the attack, an execution carried out in front of the seat of government, demanded the most severe sentence possible. However, as they began to prepare the legal foundation for such a move, they discovered that they were operating in a total, logistical void. The investigation into the feasibility of the death penalty revealed a shocking lack of infrastructure. There was no facility on the island equipped to hold a prisoner on death row, no protocol for the administration of a lethal injection, and most alarmingly, no medical professional in the territory who was willing to participate in the execution process. The ethical and logistical hurdles were insurmountable. The government explored the possibility of transferring the prisoner to a mainland United States facility to carry out the sentence, but this suggestion collapsed under the weight of jurisdictional conflicts and the complexities of territorial sovereignty. The legal system found itself trapped in a paralyzing loop. They had a convicted shooter, a clear, open-and-shut case of cold-blooded murder, and a public that demanded the ultimate punishment, but they possessed absolutely no legal, physical, or moral mechanism to actually carry it out. This forced the authorities to eventually withdraw the request for the death penalty, a decision that caused deep, lingering resentment among the officers who had risked their lives to stop the carnage. As the death penalty was removed from the table, the defense team initiated the second, equally tortuous phase of the legal process, the psychiatric evaluation. In an effort to mitigate the sentencing, the defense lawyers argued that Sialmo was suffering from profound, undiagnosed psychological issues at the time of the shooting. They posited that he was a victim of a mental breakdown, a man whose perception of reality had been irreparably fractured by the perceived systemic persecution of his family. The plea was essentially one of temporary insanity or a diminished capacity to understand the criminality of his actions. This argument effectively halted the judicial momentum. For the next several years, from 2011 through 2015, the entire legal machinery of American Samoa was diverted into a grueling series of independent, court-ordered psychiatric examinations. Each evaluation required the transportation of specialized medical experts to the remote island, lengthy observation periods, and the meticulous crafting of reports that would eventually be dissected and challenged in open court. The delay was excruciating for the surviving victims and the family of Lieutenant Brown. They were forced to endure a state of perpetual, unresolved trauma. Every status hearing, every motion filed by the defense to delay the proceedings for more testing, felt like an additional, cruel insult to the memory of the fallen. The courthouse, the very site of the massacre, became a place where the wound was periodically reopened. The defense strategy was undeniably successful in one regard. It kept the case from reaching a final resolution for half a decade. Yet, during these years of investigation and evaluation, the island itself was undergoing a quiet, fundamental transformation. The memories of the shooting were slowly being integrated into the public consciousness, not as an event to be forgiven and forgotten, but as a catalyst for institutional change. Behind the scenes of the agonizing judicial delays, the territorial government was conducting its own form of investigation. They were probing the systemic failures that had allowed an armed individual to reach the courthouse steps without being challenged by an armed counterpart. The reports generated during this period were damning. They highlighted the gross, institutional negligence of operating a modern law enforcement agency in a dangerous world while clinging to a romantic, antiquated notion of policing. The investigation into the incident report, the response times, and the lack of tactical gear for the responding officers became a roadmap for the future. It wasn't just about the guilt of Siamo Jr., it was about the guilt of a system that had left its protectors fundamentally incapable of protecting themselves. The forensic analysis of the scene, the bullet trajectory reports, and the interviews with the surviving officers all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. The officers were sitting ducks because the system insisted on keeping them that way. As the years dragged on, the intense investigative focus shifted toward the final resolution. By 2016, the psychiatric reports, after countless revisions and challenges, converged on a singular, definitive conclusion. Siamo Jr. was legally sane. He possessed the full cognitive capacity to understand the nature of his actions, to appreciate the wrongfulness of his behavior, and to control his impulses at the time of the shooting. The defense's narrative of a man consumed by a sudden, irresistible mental break was finally dismantled. With this psychiatric shield removed, the defense team was forced to acknowledge the overwhelming weight of the evidence against their client. Faced with the reality of a trial that would almost certainly result in a life sentence, and likely to avoid the spectacle of a public trial that would force the victims to relive the horror on the stand, the lawyers entered into negotiations for a plea bargain. The plea agreement, signed in 2016, finally brought an end to the 6-year legal odyssey. Siamo Jr. agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder and multiple counts of violent assault with a deadly weapon. The agreement spared the island the trauma of a full trial, but it also cemented the reality that the man who had torn the heart out of their police department would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, with no possibility of parole. The investigation, which had spanned half a decade of technical, psychiatric, and legal maneuvering, reached its closure. The files were archived, the evidence was logged away, and the courtrooms of Fagatogo were finally allowed to process cases that did not revolve around the central, haunting memory of that July morning. However, the investigation also left behind a permanent record of the cost of complacency. It stood as a cold, factual testament to the fact that when an institution ignores the shifting realities of the world around it, it inevitably pays for that ignorance in the blood of its best and bravest. The legal process had taken the full measure of the man who held the gun, but it had also, by default, taken the measure of a territory that had been forced to grow up in the most violent way imaginable. The investigation was over, but the structural consequences of the massacre were just beginning to take root in the new, permanent policies that would reshape the American Samoa Police Department forever. The transition from the years of agonizing, stalling legal proceedings to the definitive moment of sentencing in 2016 marked a profound pivot point in the judicial history of American Samoa. When the long-awaited day finally arrived, the atmosphere inside the Fagatogo High Court was not one of boisterous triumph, but of heavy, somber reflection. For the surviving officers, the family of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, and the broader community that had been forced to witness the shattering of their long-held illusions of safety, the courtroom was a space where the trauma of the past 6 years finally collided with the necessity of closure. Siamo Jr., the man who had irrevocably altered the trajectory of their lives with a 9mm handgun, stood before the bench, no longer a volatile, unpredictable threat, but a defendant trapped in the cold, unyielding machinery of the law. The legal strategy of the defense, which had spent years laboring to construct a narrative of mental instability and diminished capacity, had ultimately collapsed under the weight of the psychiatric reports confirming his full cognitive awareness. The plea agreement, a calculated decision made to avert the potential trauma of a public trial and to ensure a guaranteed outcome, brought the courtroom to a stillness that felt both final and hollow. The sentencing hearing itself served as the grim, final accounting of the debt Siamo owed to the territory. As the presiding judge formally entered the plea of guilty to first-degree murder and multiple counts of violent assault with a deadly weapon, the courtroom was permeated by the absolute weight of the consequences. There were no outbursts of anger, no sudden displays of emotion from the defendant. There was only the clinical, measured delivery of the final judgment. The sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole was not merely a punishment. It was an acknowledgement of the permanent nature of the harm inflicted. For the survivors of the shooting, those officers who had been physically and psychologically shattered while attempting to charge the shooter, this judgment provided a necessary, if insufficient, sense of legal finality. It formally categorized the atrocity not as the impulsive act of a fractured mind, but as a deliberate, calculated, and malicious assault on the very foundations of the community. The court had, in its own way, validated the immense suffering of the police force, ensuring that the man who had taken the life of their mentor and peer would never again be permitted to breathe the free air of the island he had terrorized. However, the legal result was only one side of the coin. The deeper, more complex reality was the profound transformation of the courtroom experience itself. The 6-year ordeal had fundamentally changed how the territory viewed the relationship between the judiciary and the reality of violent crime. The initial, desperate, and ultimately futile push for the death penalty had exposed the territory's total lack of preparedness for the extreme end of the criminal justice spectrum. This failure was a searing, uncomfortable truth that forced the government to confront its own limitations. The realization that they could not carry out the sentence they sought because they lacked the necessary infrastructure, the medical support, and the moral or physical facility to do so, served as a stark, humbling reminder of the distance between their legal statutes and their practical capabilities. The ultimate resolution, life without parole, became the realistic ceiling of their justice system, a recognition that the territory would have to rely on the durability of its prison walls rather than the finality of the execution chamber to ensure public safety. The dynamics inside the courtroom during these final proceedings were also shaped by the absence of the man who should have been standing as a primary witness and a symbol of the triumph of law, Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. His absence was a haunting, palpable presence throughout the sentencing. The impact statements presented by his grieving family and his fellow officers served to bridge the gap between the sterile, cold legal documents and the human reality of his sacrifice. They spoke not of a case file or a defendant, but of a husband, a father, a leader, and a friend who had been violently stripped away from them. These testimonies ensured that the final judgment was not merely an administrative procedure, but an acknowledgement of a profound, irreparable loss. The legal system, while limited in its ability to restore what was broken, performed its duty by officially memorializing the gravity of the crime. By the time the gavel fell, the court had successfully moved beyond the years of psychiatric obfuscation, focusing squarely on the facts of the massacre and the permanence of the sentence. The plea bargain, while avoiding the public spectacle of a trial, nonetheless served its purpose in crystallizing the narrative for posterity. It left no room for ambiguity regarding the shooter's state of mind or the premeditated nature of his violence. The record was now finalized, written in the dry, authoritative language of court documents that would remain in the territorial archives for decades to come. This resolution allowed the judicial system to finally move on, to shift its resources back to the daily, pressing concerns of the territory, yet it left the community with the daunting task of reconciling the legal end of the case with the psychological reality of the aftermath. The sentencing was the closing of a door, but for many on the island, the memory of that July morning remained a vivid, open wound that no amount of time in a prison cell could ever truly heal. The court had provided the justice they requested, but it could not provide the peace that had been so easily shattered in the span of 3 short minutes. The process from the arrest in 2010 to the final plea in 2016 was a slow, grueling education for the territory. It forced the legal establishment to grapple with the realities of modern forensic standards, the necessity of rigorous psychiatric evaluation, and the complexities of constitutional rights within a remote, island-based jurisdiction. It tested the resilience of the prosecutors, the patience of the victims, and the integrity of the judicial process itself. The success of the final resolution was not in its speed or its simplicity, but in its ability to eventually reach a conclusion that aligned with the facts of the case, despite the many years of tactical delays and legal maneuvering. The outcome ensured that the perpetrator was permanently removed from society, a fact that provided a baseline of security for the officers who still patrolled the streets and the courts of the island. As the final chapters of the legal drama closed, it became evident that the true victory was not found in the court's decision alone, but in the collective capacity of the community to survive the ordeal. The survival of the two critically wounded officers, their return to duty, and the eventual solidification of the police force into a more modern, tactically aware entity all occurred in the shadow of the legal process. The court had played its part, but it was the community that had to do the heavy lifting of rebuilding itself in the wake of the loss. The legal result, as cold and definitive as it was, served as the essential foundation upon which that rebuilding could finally proceed. It was the period at the end of a long, terrifying sentence, allowing the island to slowly begin to draft a new narrative, one that acknowledged the danger they had faced, the price they had paid, and the permanent changes they had adopted to ensure that the peace of their island would be better protected in the future. The law had spoken, the defendant was imprisoned for life, and the Fagatogo High Court was finally permitted to return to its primary, noble function, far removed from the stain of the violence that had once threatened to consume it entirely. The echoes of the gunfire that erupted on that Thursday morning in July of 2010 did not fade with the conclusion of the legal proceedings 6 years later. Instead, those echoes became the foundational frequency upon which the modern era of law enforcement in American Samoa was constructed. The massacre at the Fagatogo High Court was a brutal, irreversible initiation into a reality that the territory had long hoped to avoid, a world where the badge was no longer an impenetrable shield, and where the societal contract of mutual respect was insufficient to guarantee the safety of those who enforce the law. This horrific event forced a total, top-down reassessment of every protocol, every piece of equipment, and every tactical assumption that had guided the police department for generations. It was a period of painful institutional introspection, where the pride of being an unarmed, community-based force was weighed against the grim, cold reality of the grave. The transformation that followed was not merely an aesthetic change in uniforms or a simple upgrade in hardware. It was a fundamental shift in the psychological and operational doctrine of the entire organization. The most immediate and transformative consequence of the massacre was the categorical end of the era of the unarmed patrol officer. For decades, the absence of firearms had been a point of pride for the American Samoa Police Department, a testament to the peaceful nature of the island's culture and the success of the traditional Fa'a Samoa approach to conflict. However, the tragedy proved that this tradition, while noble in its intent, left the protectors of the community in a position of total, fatal vulnerability when confronted by an individual who had discarded the social contract. In the wake of the shooting, the Fono, the territory's legislature, moved with uncharacteristic speed to authorize the permanent arming of the police force. This was a decision born of deep collective trauma and a pragmatic realization that the modern criminal landscape, even in a remote territory, had evolved beyond the scope of unarmed intervention. The transition involved not just the procurement of sidearms, but a massive, intensive investment in training. Officers who had previously only been trained in verbal de-escalation, baton techniques, and basic physical restraint were suddenly thrust into a curriculum defined by ballistic proficiency, tactical decision-making, and the grim responsibilities of lethal force. This shift brought with it a complex, internal debate about the nature of the island's identity. Many within the community worried that the introduction of firearms would fundamentally alter the relationship between the police and the citizens, creating an adversarial distance where there had once been intimate connection. The police leadership faced the Herculean task of balancing this new reality. They had to empower their officers to protect themselves against armed threats without sacrificing the community policing ethos that had defined Lieutenant Lucilla Brown's 19 years of service. It was a delicate, often agonizing process of redefining what it meant to be a guardian. The new training protocols were designed to ensure that the weapon was the absolute last resort, a tool of defense rather than a means of enforcement. The culture of the force had to evolve from a philosophy that assumed the best in every interaction to one that retained the caution and vigilance required to survive in a world where the unexpected was now a statistical possibility. Beyond the tactical equipment, the psychological fallout of the massacre left a permanent scar on the institutional consciousness of the department. The loss of Lieutenant Brown was not treated as a bureaucratic statistic. It was remembered as a foundational moment of sacrifice that demanded constant honor. Every new recruit entering the academy was told the story of the Fagatogo High Court, not as a lesson in vengeance, but as a lesson in the high, unpredictable cost of duty. The trauma experienced by the two officers who had heroically engaged the shooter with nothing but their courage served as a stark, living reminder of why the shift to armed patrol was so vital. Their recovery, their grueling physical therapy, and their eventual return to service became symbols of the resilience of the force. They did not retreat, they helped build the new foundation. This spirit of resilience became a defining trait of the reorganized department, a collective determination to ensure that never again would an officer be placed in a position where their only option was to charge a shooter with bare hands. The broader impact on the society of American Samoa was equally profound, though perhaps less tangible. The community was forced to grapple with the realization that their island was not an isolated Eden, exempt from the darker currents of the modern world. The crime had occurred at the absolute heart of their judicial system, violating the sanctity of the High Court and forcing the public to confront the reality of violent crime in a way that previous, smaller incidents had never demanded. The years of legal delays, the psychiatric debates, and the eventual life sentence of Siamo Jr. were all absorbed into the public memory, serving as a reminder of the persistence required to maintain justice in the face of such a profound breach. The massacre became a generational marker, a dividing line between the past, where the police walked their beats with nothing but their presence, and the present, where they stand prepared for the worst while continuing to serve a community they are deeply a part of. Reflecting on the legacy of the event, it is clear that the tragedy did not destroy the spirit of the police department. It refined it. The sacrifice of Lieutenant Brown and the near-fatal injuries suffered by his colleagues created a new, stronger institutional commitment to the protection of those who protect the public. The department evolved into a modern, tactically aware force that still prioritizes the deep, human connections that made their unarmed predecessors so effective, but now does so with the necessary safety measures to ensure that every officer has the chance to return home at the end of their shift. The legacy of the Fagatogo High Court is not just one of death and loss, it is one of necessary, forced evolution. It is the story of a system that looked into the abyss of its own vulnerabilities and chose to adapt, to strengthen, and to commit itself anew to the mission of peacekeeping. As the years continue to move forward, the memory of July 22, 2010, remains as a silent, solemn sentinel in the history of American Samoa. It is a day that is remembered with heavy hearts, but also with a sense of pride in the way the territory responded. They did not succumb to anarchy, they did not lose their faith in the justice system, and they did not discard their commitment to the rule of law. Instead, they navigated the long, dark tunnel of the legal process, they processed their grief, and they systematically dismantled the conditions that had allowed the tragedy to occur. The transformation of the American Samoa Police Department stands as a testament to the territory's ability to withstand even the most brutal of shocks and emerge on the other side as a more prepared, more capable, and ultimately more resilient society. The lesson of that Thursday morning, that the price of liberty and peace is sometimes paid in the sacrifice of the very best among us, has been etched into the foundation of the territory, ensuring that while the past can never be undone, the future is now guarded with the vigilance and the preparedness that such a devastating history demands. The duty of the protector is forever changed, but the mission remains the same, to stand as the bridge between order and chaos, now equipped to ensure that the bridge remains standing, regardless of the storms that may rise to challenge it. The story of Fagatogo is a final, enduring chapter in the book of the island's innocence, but it is also the first, definitive chapter in its maturity, representing the moment when the territory looked at the face of evil and decided, once and for all, that the law would prevail, the guardians would be protected, and the peace of the island would be held fast against any who sought to shatter it. The narrative of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy, while centered on the irreversible loss of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown and the shattering of an era, extends its reach far beyond the specific confines of that single, catastrophic morning. To truly understand the resonance of this event in the annals of American Samoa, one must look at how the memory of the event serves as a moral and operational compass for the present and the future. The transformation of the American Samoa Police Department was not merely a series of administrative adjustments, it was a profound act of collective grieving and institutional rebirth. Every time an officer straps on their tactical gear, checks their firearm, and steps into a patrol vehicle, they are doing so in the shadow of the lessons learned on that July day. The equipment is a constant, tangible reminder of the price paid for the previous era's vulnerability. It is a symbol of a territory that acknowledged its own dangerous naivety and committed itself to a new standard of preparedness. This preparedness, however, is not characterized by a hardening of the heart or a retreat from the community-based policing model. On the contrary, the current force has worked tirelessly to integrate their newfound tactical capabilities with the deep-rooted cultural values of their home. The goal has been to maintain the strength of the connection between the police and the citizens, the very connection that Lieutenant Brown nurtured for 19 years, while ensuring that this connection is no longer held together by the thin thread of assumed safety, but by the robust reality of professional, armed security. In the years that have passed, the territory has developed a unique approach to law enforcement that mirrors its distinct cultural identity. The lessons of the Fagatogo shooting are integrated into the culture of the police academy, serving as the core component of a curriculum that balances modern tactical training with the traditional responsibilities of a community guardian. The story of Lieutenant Brown is recounted not as a cautionary tale of despair, but as a narrative of ultimate professional duty. It highlights the requirement for modern officers to possess both the compassion to understand the struggles of their fellow citizens and the clinical, decisive capability to intervene when those struggles manifest in lethal violence. This dual requirement is the hallmark of the post-2010 American Samoa Police Department. It is a department that has successfully reconciled its past with the harsh demands of the present. The officers who serve today do so with a clear-eyed understanding that the protection they provide is a vital, non-negotiable service, one that requires the highest level of training and the most rigorous commitment to the rule of law. They recognize that their ability to serve the community is contingent upon their ability to survive, and that survival is a professional responsibility they owe to the people they represent. The impact of the event on the judiciary was equally enduring. The Fagatogo High Court, while returned to its noble function as the seat of justice, carries the weight of its own history. The physical structure, the hallways, and the parking areas where the attack took place are now treated with a heightened level of security that reflects the lessons of 2010. The judicial process, having been stress-tested by the 6-year legal odyssey involving Siamo Jr., has emerged with a clearer understanding of its own procedural boundaries and a renewed focus on efficiency. The court learned the hard way that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, but justice that can be hijacked by those seeking to exploit the vulnerabilities of the legal system through persistent, tactical delays. As a result, the judiciary has implemented more robust protocols for managing complex criminal cases, ensuring that the wheels of justice turn with a consistency that respects both the rights of the accused and the urgent need for closure for the victims. The court remains the final arbiter of truth, but it now operates with a sharpened awareness of the dangers that can surround it, ensuring that its sanctity is protected by those who understand the true weight of the gavel. The enduring legacy of the tragedy also manifests in the way the territory remembers its fallen. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown remains a figure of singular importance, a man whose 19-year legacy has been codified in the history of the police department. His name is synonymous with the values of integrity, community connection, and selfless duty. His family, who stood at the center of the storm, remains an integral part of the narrative of the island, serving as a testament to the strength required to endure the ultimate loss. Their journey, from the moment of the shooting to the final sentencing of the man who killed their loved one, is a story of profound endurance. It serves as a reminder that the cost of such an event is not just paid by the state, but by the hearts and souls of the individuals who are left to pick up the pieces. Their resilience is the true foundation of the island's recovery, a quiet, daily act of heroism that parallels the public heroism of the officers who stood their ground on that dark morning. Looking back, the shooting can be viewed as the definitive end of the territory's childhood. American Samoa was forced to abandon the comforting, though fragile, illusion that their geographical isolation provided a natural shield against the darker realities of the world. The event forced them into a sudden, painful, and necessary maturity. They had to learn how to confront a threat that arrived from within their own community, a threat that understood the vulnerabilities of the system better than anyone else. The maturity that followed was not marked by a loss of the unique, traditional character of the territory, but by an evolution of that character into something more resilient and capable of sustaining itself. The island remains a place of deep connection, traditional values, and a strong sense of communal identity, but it is now a place that understands the necessity of safeguarding that identity with the full, professional weight of the law. The broader lesson for other jurisdictions, perhaps, is that the vulnerability of an unarmed police force is not a measure of the community's morality, but a measure of its exposure. The transition from an unarmed to an armed force is a difficult, wrenching decision that must be made with eyes wide open to the cultural costs. American Samoa navigated this transition with a deliberation and a commitment to their community roots that serves as a model for how a jurisdiction can modernize without losing its soul. They did not outsource their security, they did not abandon their principles, and they did not allow the tragedy to tear them apart. They integrated the tragedy into the fabric of their identity, using the memory of the loss to drive the development of a more effective and more professional law enforcement presence. This is the ultimate triumph of the community, that they were able to absorb such a horrific blow and emerge not with a thirst for vengeance, but with a renewed commitment to the principles of order and justice. The ongoing vigilance of the American Samoa Police Department is the most fitting monument to the memory of Lieutenant Brown. It is a living, breathing testament to the commitment of the officers who continue to serve, knowing the full history of the organization they have joined. They are the heirs to the legacy of the Fagatogo shooting, carrying the weight of the past into the responsibilities of the present. They work in a jurisdiction that is safer, more professional, and more prepared because of the lessons that were bought with the life of a hero. The story of the Fagatogo High Court shooting will always be a part of the territory's narrative, a reminder of the darkness that can arise in any community, but also a reminder of the capacity for light, resilience, and institutional progress. It is a story that has been fully told, from the initial, peaceful mourning to the eventual sentencing, and finally to the long-term transformation of the institution that suffered the most. Through this comprehensive accounting, the island has ensured that the memory of what was lost is matched by the strength of what was built, securing a future that is guarded, protected, and firmly committed to the values that Lieutenant Brown upheld throughout his 19 years of honorable service. The cycle of the tragedy is complete, its lessons have been integrated, and the territory stands today as a testament to the enduring power of a community that refuses to be defined by the violence it has suffered, but rather by the resolve with which it has responded to it. The culmination of this profound narrative brings us to a place of final, solemn reflection on the nature of sacrifice, the fragility of institutional peace, and the enduring strength of a community tested by the unimaginable. To conclude the story of the Fagatogo High Court massacre is to accept that the events of that July day in 2010 are not merely an isolated entry in a criminal ledger, but a permanent, defining chapter in the history of American Samoa. It is a story that refuses to be neatly tucked away because its ripples continue to influence the heartbeat of the island's civic life. When we contemplate the life of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, we are not just honoring a fallen officer. We are recognizing the embodiment of an entire era of public service, a time when the strength of one's character and the depth of one's community ties were the primary tools of the trade. His 19 years of service represent a legacy of trust that was so profound it served as the very foundation of the territory's internal security. That trust was tested and shattered in a matter of moments, yet the response of his colleagues, his family, and the government that succeeded him has been to build a new foundation, one that acknowledges the darkness of the world while remaining steadfast in the commitment to justice. The trajectory of the investigation, the legal battles, and the subsequent institutional overhaul underscores a critical truth about the evolution of modern law enforcement. It reveals that the transition from a traditional, community-based model to a tactically capable, modern police force is not an abandonment of values, but a necessary expansion of them. The American Samoa Police Department of today stands as a hybrid. It retains the intimacy and local focus that define the era of the unarmed officer, but it now possesses the professional, tactical readiness to defend that very focus against the modern manifestations of violence. This balance is the true, hard-won victory of the years following the shooting. It required an immense amount of political courage, institutional patience, and public support to navigate the transition. The fact that the territory accomplished this while staying true to its core identity is a testament to the character of the people of American Samoa. They did not allow the horror of the event to turn their society into a place of suspicion or division. Instead, they moved forward with a sense of collective purpose, determined that their identity would be defined by their resilience rather than their tragedy. The legal journey that concluded in 2016 was the final necessary process of closure for the justice system. The sentencing of Siamo Jr. was not just a judicial outcome, it was a societal affirmation that the actions taken on that courthouse steps were an unacceptable assault on the collective peace. By ensuring the perpetrator remained behind bars for the rest of his life, the territory sent a clear, unambiguous message about the sanctity of the institutions that represent the rule of law. It served to validate the sacrifices of the victims, providing a measure of security to the surviving officers who continued to put on their uniforms every day. This legal resolution allowed the community to stop looking backward at the trauma of the crime and start looking forward at the challenges of the future. The years spent in the courtroom, while painful, served to solidify the facts of the case, ensuring that history would record exactly what occurred and that the responsibility for the loss of life was assigned directly to the individual who chose to pick up the weapon. Reflecting on the psychological impact, it becomes clear that the healing process of the island has been as much about the reclamation of the courthouse as it was about the hardening of the police department. The Fagatogo High Court stands today not as a monument to a massacre, but as a functional, vibrant, and protected space where the work of justice continues uninterrupted. This reclamation of space is a powerful symbol of the territory's refusal to be defined by the violence that once visited its doorstep. By continuing to hold hearings, to weigh evidence, and to deliver verdicts within those same walls, the judicial system asserts its dominance over the chaotic impulses of those who would seek to disrupt it. It is a daily, routine assertion of the strength of the rule of law. Every attorney who walks those halls, every judge who sits at the bench, and every witness who provides testimony is participating in a small, cumulative act of resistance against the memory of the shooter's rage. They are demonstrating that the work of justice is not fragile and that it does not cease in the face of terror. The role of the media and the public narrative in this story also deserves acknowledgement. By engaging with the history of the event with a level of seriousness and respect, the community has ensured that the memory of Lieutenant Brown remains untainted by the sensationalism that so often accompanies stories of true crime. There is a deep, honorable dignity in how the territory has chosen to remember its fallen, focusing on the character of the man and the impact of his service rather than the gore of his passing. This collective memory serves as a protective layer, shielding the legacy of the tragedy from being distorted by rumor or misunderstanding. It is a story that belongs to the people of American Samoa, and they have guarded it with a care that speaks volumes about their culture and their values. The story has been told, analyzed, and integrated into the public consciousness, serving as a permanent guidepost for the generations of public servants who will follow. As we bring this account to its final conclusion, we must emphasize the ongoing nature of the mission that Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues undertook. The peace of any community is never a static condition. It is a dynamic, evolving process that requires constant, vigilant attention. The massacre was a brutal interruption of that process, but the response was a renewal of it. The police officers who serve today do so in a different world than the one Lieutenant Brown navigated, but they share the same fundamental, sacred goal: to act as the stewards of the peace. The lessons of the past are not burdens that drag them down. They are the insights that lift them up, providing the clarity and the tactical wisdom necessary to face the unknown. The story of the Fagatogo High Court is, ultimately, a story about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of inexplicable malice. It is about the ability of a society to suffer an unimaginable loss and to respond not with surrender, but with a renewed commitment to the principles of human dignity and public safety. The legacy of the tragedy is found in every officer who continues their service with pride, every judge who upholds the law with integrity, and every citizen who feels secure in the knowledge that their community is guarded by men and women who have learned from history. The era of the unarmed patrol officer may have ended in smoke and blood, but the era of the modern, prepared, and deeply connected guardian has taken its place. It is a legacy of honor, forged in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. As the tropical sun continues to shine down on the courthouse in Fagatogo, it illuminates a place that has been tested, tempered, and ultimately strengthened by its own history. The tragedy of July 22, 2010 will never be forgotten, but it has been successfully woven into a broader narrative of recovery, adaptation, and unwavering resolve. This narrative stands as a testament to the fact that when a community unites in its commitment to truth, justice, and the protection of the innocent, it possesses a strength that can overcome even the darkest of storms. The mission of the Guardian remains the same, the values remain the same, and the dedication remains as steadfast as ever, ensuring that the legacy of those who gave their all is honored in the continued, professional service of those who remain. The history of the territory has been indelibly marked, but its future, written by those who carry the memory of that day with honor and tactical wisdom, remains a future defined by the very peace that the Fagatogo High Court was built to defend. This is the ultimate, enduring conclusion of the story, that the light of the justice they served has not been extinguished. It has been passed on, through blood and sacrifice, into the hands of those who are now better prepared than ever to hold it high, ensuring that the dark and tragic events of that morning in 2010 remain exactly where they belong, in the past as a stark, permanent reminder of the duty that now guides the future of the islands. The finality of this account, as we survey the landscape of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy from the vantage point of the present, is not found in the resolution of the legal case or the modernization of the police force, but in the internal transformation of the collective memory of American Samoa. To live in the aftermath of such a cataclysmic event is to exist in a state of permanent, reflective stewardship over the memory of what was lost. The island has had to learn how to carry the weight of its own history without allowing that weight to become an anchor that prevents the society from moving forward. This process of psychological integration is perhaps the most significant, yet least visible, achievement of the territory in the years following the massacre. It is the ability to acknowledge the scars of the past while simultaneously embracing the necessity of the future. The people of this territory have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to transform their grief into a deliberate, institutionalized form of vigilance, ensuring that the sacrifice of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown is not merely a name on a memorial, but a living, breathing component of every decision that currently guides the security and justice of the land. This stewardship of memory is particularly evident in the way the territory addresses the issue of public safety today. The transition to an armed police force was a surgical, necessary intervention in the body politic of the island, but the true accomplishment lies in how the police have utilized this capability without losing their soul. They have managed to maintain the traditional, community-centric model of law enforcement while adopting the tactical precision required to handle modern threats. This synthesis is the ultimate tribute to the officers who stood their ground on that dark morning. It represents a promise made to the past that the lessons learned would be used to cultivate a more resilient, better prepared society. Every patrol, every court security shift, and every public engagement is conducted with a quiet, solemn awareness of the vulnerability that was once exposed. This awareness does not manifest as paranoia, but as a professional, standardized competence that serves as a constant, invisible safeguard for the citizens of the territory. As we consider the broader impact of this tragedy, We must also recognize the significance of the territorial government's commitment to the rule of law throughout the ordeal. By rejecting the shortcuts that might have been tempting in the wake of such a high-profile, emotionally charged crime, the government demonstrated a profound respect for the democratic institutions that define the American identity within the islands. The 6-year legal process, while incredibly taxing on all parties involved, was a rigorous demonstration of the commitment to due process. Even when faced with the agonizing limits of their own infrastructure and the limitations of their judicial capability, the authorities did not break. They navigated the procedural requirements with a level of integrity that reflected well on the territory's judicial branch. They proved that even in the most remote corners of the jurisdiction, the law remains the ultimate, final word, and that no individual, regardless of their family ties or their capacity for violence, exists outside the reach of that mandate. The story also offers a profound lesson on the resilience of the family units within American Samoa. The family of Lieutenant Brown, by enduring the long, public legal battle and the constant revisiting of their tragedy, provided an example of quiet, private heroism that the entire territory has drawn strength from. Their experience reminds us that the victims of such crimes are not just the individuals directly targeted, but the families and the wider circles of relationships that are also irrevocably damaged. The way the territory has rallied around these families, providing support and respect over the course of more than a decade, is a testament to the strength of the cultural fabric that continues to define the island. It is a reminder that the true protection of a community does not come from its laws or its weapons, but from the bonds of care and solidarity that allow it to survive even the most horrific of trials. The judicial resolution of the case in 2016 served as a necessary closure, but it also invited the territory to define what justice truly means in the aftermath of such a loss. Justice in this context was not just about the incarceration of the perpetrator, it was about the restoration of the sanctity of the High Court. By returning to the normal operation of the judicial system, the territory signaled that the violence of 2010 was an anomaly, not a new standard. They proved that the courtroom is a space dedicated to the objective, methodical pursuit of truth, and that it is not a place that can be permanently stained or altered by the rage of those who despise the law. This restoration of normalcy is a vital part of the recovery, a daily affirmation that the community's commitment to the rule of law is stronger than any individual's attempt to destroy it. As the years continue to pass, the narrative of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy will undoubtedly become part of the foundational lore of the territory. It will be passed down to new generations of public servants, not as a story to incite fear, but as a story to instill a profound, necessary sense of duty. The young police officer of the future, entering the academy, will look at the history of this event and understand that they are joining an organization that has been tested in the fires of reality and has emerged with a clear, unambiguous sense of purpose. They will understand that their role as a guardian is both a privilege and a heavy responsibility, one that must be executed with the highest level of professionalism and vigilance. This transfer of institutional knowledge is the ultimate insurance policy against the recurrence of such tragedy, ensuring that the lessons bought with the life of Lieutenant Brown remain fresh and operative. Finally, we must acknowledge the broader, perhaps more philosophical, conclusion to be drawn from these events. The Fagatogo High Court massacre was a moment where the idyllic, insulated, and peaceful nature of island life was violently confronted by the harsh, cold realities of the world. The response of the territory was to embrace the challenge of maturity, to acknowledge their vulnerabilities, and to dedicate themselves to the hard work of building a more secure and just society. It was a journey from innocence to wisdom, a process that was as painful as it was necessary. Today, the territory stands as a beacon of resilience, proving that even in the most remote locations, the commitment to human dignity and the rule of law can prevail over the forces of disorder. The legacy of those who gave their lives on that morning is not found in the stone of a monument, but in the continued, professional service of the individuals who strive every day to keep the peace. As we close this long, comprehensive reflection, we are left with a final sense of solemnity and resolve. The story of the Fagatogo High Court has been fully articulated, its details scrutinized, its lessons extracted, and its impact integrated. It serves as a reminder that the safety we enjoy is not an inherent quality of our geography or our culture, but a consequence of the continued, vigilant efforts of those who hold the line. The sacrifice made by the officers of the American Samoa Police Department on that July morning remains a debt that the territory will never be able to fully repay, but it is a debt that they acknowledge every day in their continued, steadfast commitment to the mission. The justice they sought was achieved, the institutional changes they required were implemented, and the resilience they exhibited continues to be the bedrock upon which the future of the islands is being built. The tragedy is part of their past, but it no longer dictates their future. Instead, it serves as the foundation for a more prepared, more professional, and more deeply committed society, ensuring that the legacy of those who protected the islands with their lives continues to shine through the work of those who follow in their footsteps, dedicated to the same mission, bound by the same values, and ever watchful over the peace they have worked so hard to preserve. The narrative is complete, but the work, the noble, essential, and demanding work of maintaining order and justice, continues, just as it must, in every corner of the territory, each and every day, honoring the memory of the fallen by securing the safety of the living, standing firm in the knowledge that they are the architects of a future where the darkness of the past is not forgotten, but is held in check by the eternal vigilance of those who stand for the right. The final chapter of this narrative is not merely a closing statement, but a profound testament to the endurance of the human spirit when confronted with the absolute void of tragedy. As we step back from the granular details of the Fagatogo High Court massacre, the chilling sequence of gunfire, the agonizing years of legal debate, and the eventual, necessary transformation of the territorial police force, we are left to contemplate the enduring truth that defines American Samoa today. The territory has navigated the deepest, darkest waters a society can endure, moving from the sudden, violent rupture of its peaceful tradition to the deliberate, methodical construction of a modern, resilient foundation. This journey of over a decade was not defined by a single moment of clarity, but by 1,000 small, daily choices made by individuals who refused to let the brutality of one morning define the character of their entire nation. The officers who returned to the streets, the clerks who returned to their desks in the High Court, and the family members who sought closure through a grueling judicial process were all, in their own way, architects of a new reality. They chose to build, they chose to endure, and they chose to believe in a future where their community could be both traditional in its values and professional in its protection. This final perspective requires us to look past the individual actions of the perpetrator, who is now a permanent resident of a prison cell, and instead focus on the collective triumph of those who were targeted by his rage. The true measure of any society is not how it avoids catastrophe, for catastrophe is often an unpredictable force, but how it rebuilds itself once the smoke has cleared. American Samoa's response has been a masterclass in institutional and psychological recovery. By integrating the tragedy into their history, they have stripped it of its power to cause further chaos. It no longer represents a threat to the stability of the island. It now serves as a foundational pillar of their resolve. The Fagatogo High Court, once the site of an unthinkable violation, is now a functioning beacon of the rule of law, proving that no amount of violence can permanently displace the foundational necessity of justice. This is the most profound victory of all, the refusal to surrender the sanctity of the courtroom to the impulse of the assassin. Furthermore, the legacy of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown has transcended his individual existence, becoming a guiding archetype for what it means to be a servant of the public interest in a dangerous world. His 19 years of service now provide the standard by which all subsequent generations of officers measure their commitment. He has become a symbolic lighthouse, representing the ideal balance between deep, empathetic community connection and the unwavering adherence to the law. The modern officer in American Samoa carries the weight of this legacy, understanding that they are not just protecting territory or enforcing statutes, but are the living embodiment of a community that has survived the worst and chosen to remain steadfast. This deep, internal commitment to honor the fallen by protecting the living is the most powerful deterrent against any future attempt to disrupt the peace of the islands. It is a psychological safeguard that is far more durable than any weapon they now carry. As we conclude this expansive account, we must also reflect on the broader significance of the territory's journey for the global understanding of law enforcement. The American Samoa experience serves as a definitive case study in the evolution of policing from a localized, trust-based system to a modern, tactically prepared agency. It highlights the inherent risks of maintaining a system that relies solely on societal good faith in a world where good faith is not a universal standard. The territory's decision to modernize was a decision made with great care, respect for tradition, and a clear-eyed view of reality. It proves that a community does not have to sacrifice its cultural identity to embrace the professional standards required for survival in the 21st century. This synthesis of culture and capability is perhaps the greatest gift that American Samoa offers to the ongoing discourse about public safety and the nature of the Guardian. The resolution of the legal case in 2016, the finalization of the prison sentence, and the institutional hardening of the police department have all combined to create a sense of settled, historical closure. The story is no longer a current event. It is now a part of the territorial heritage. It has been examined, understood, and placed within the context of a wider history of growth and adaptation. This is the natural and necessary endpoint for any tragedy of this magnitude. When an event stops being a source of panic and starts being a source of wisdom, the society has successfully navigated the path to maturity. American Samoa has arrived at this point, standing tall as a place where the rule of law is respected, the police are empowered, and the memory of the past is honored through the continued, diligent pursuit of a better, safer future. We must also acknowledge the resilience of the judicial and legislative bodies that navigated the complex, often frustrating path of the last 15 years. They stood as the defenders of the process, ensuring that even when the pressures were at their highest, the standard of justice was never compromised. Their commitment to the methodical, slow, and often painful reality of the courtroom was the essential counterpart to the bravery of the officers on the ground. Together, they formed a unified front that successfully held the line. This partnership between the defenders of order and the enforcers of the law is the bedrock upon which the peace of the island currently rests. It is a partnership that was forged in the heat of a crisis and has been hardened by the time that has followed, creating a system that is significantly more capable than the one that existed on that July morning. As this final reflection comes to a close, the image that remains is not one of the violent act itself, but of the calm, orderly, and vigilant reality of the Fagatogo High Court today. The quiet corridors, the steady presence of security, and the rhythmic, predictable function of the judiciary serve as the ultimate sign that the struggle was successful. The territory has emerged on the other side of the tunnel, carrying the burden of its past with a quiet, dignified resolve. The peace of the islands is no longer taken for granted. It is understood as a fragile, precious achievement that must be tended to with constant, professional care. This is the realization that has defined the post-tragedy era, and it is the realization that will carry the territory forward into the decades to come. The mission of this narrative, from its opening hook to this final, sweeping perspective, has been to honor the sacrifice, to document the evolution, and to present the full, unvarnished history of a tragedy that refused to be the end of the story. It is a story about the resilience of a people, the strength of their institutions, and the enduring power of the truth. Lieutenant Brown's 19 years were not erased by the bullets of a man who had lost his way. They were immortalized by the actions of those who stood up to rebuild the world in his image. The justice system was not permanently broken. It was tempered and improved. The community was not torn asunder. It was united by a shared, painful experience that forced them to define who they were and who they wanted to be. This is the victory of American Samoa, a victory that is not loud or flashy, but is instead quiet, enduring, and deeply ingrained in the professional service and the communal resilience of the people who call these islands home. As the chapter on the Fagatogo High Court massacre finally closes, we can say with absolute certainty that the memory is secure. It is held in the respect of the living, in the protocols of the police, in the halls of the justice system, and in the quiet resolve of every citizen who walks the streets of Fagatogo. The island is safe, the law is upheld, and the future is guarded by a force that understands the price of peace and is eternally committed to paying it, day after day, through the noble, essential work of their duty. This is the final, definitive end of the tragedy, that it no longer causes pain, but provides perspective, and in doing so, it has transformed the tragedy into a lasting, permanent foundation for the peace and security of the entire territory, forever protecting the legacy of those who gave all for the safety of their home. The final, overarching synthesis of this narrative requires us to contemplate the enduring legacy of July 22, 2010, not as a static historical event, but as a dynamic and living force that continues to shape the identity, the security, and the moral landscape of American Samoa. As we reach this concluding vantage point, the narrative of the Fagatogo High Court tragedy transcends the parameters of a true crime account and assumes its place as a profound, foundational pillar of the territory's modern evolution. The story has been fully articulated, from the brewing, toxic resentment within the Siamo family to the cataclysmic rupture of the peace, through the grueling, protracted legal marathon that spanned over half a decade, and finally into the fundamental, systemic rebirth of the American Samoa Police Department. Each facet of this history has served to clarify a singular, vital point: the transition from a state of vulnerable, traditional innocence to a state of prepared, mature guardianship was a necessary, unavoidable response to the loss of a standard of human existence that could no longer be sustained in the face of modern, unchecked violence. The loss of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown was the catalyst for this maturation, and his memory now serves as the permanent, ethical North Star for every officer who has since donned the uniform in the interest of public safety. In the quiet, daily operations of the High Court and the rhythmic patrols that traverse the villages of the island, we find the most meaningful manifestation of the post-tragedy era. The Fagatogo High Court, once physically stained by the act of assassination, now stands as a symbol of the resilience of the rule of law. It has been reclaimed not just through the superficial maintenance of its structure, but through the continuous, rigorous application of justice that takes place within its walls. The court has proven that the legislative, judicial, and law enforcement arms of the territory can function in perfect, interdependent harmony, creating a system that is significantly more resilient than the one that failed on that Thursday morning. The procedural refinements, the emphasis on efficient case management, and the unwavering dedication of the legal professionals involved have ensured that the judiciary remains an untouchable pillar of society, despite the violent attempts to destabilize it in the past. This reclamation of the courthouse as a space of order is the ultimate victory of the citizenry over the chaos of the shooter's intent. The human element of this story, the survivors, the families of the fallen, and the community at large, provides the most lasting impression. Their collective refusal to succumb to the bitterness or the divisive cynicism that so often follows such high-profile crimes is a testament to the cultural depth of American Samoa. They did not allow the horror of the event to alienate them from one another. Instead, they used the shared experience of the tragedy to forge a tighter, more empathetic bond. This communal resilience is the true protective shield of the territory. It is a strength that operates in the spaces where laws and weapons cannot reach, ensuring that the fabric of society remains intact despite the deepest of cuts. When we look at the recovery of the officers who were critically wounded, we are witnessing the triumph of a specific kind of internal resolve, one that is informed by the memory of loss but defined by the commitment to move forward. They are the living embodiment of the territory's response, returning to the field not with a desire for retribution, but with a refined understanding of the duty they owe to their fellow citizens. The professional evolution of the police department remains perhaps the most tangible, lasting outcome of the narrative. The arming of the force and the subsequent investment in tactical, professional, and psychological training have created a law enforcement agency that is capable of meeting the challenges of the current era. This was not a move taken lightly, nor was it a move that ignored the unique cultural context of the islands. It was a carefully calibrated adaptation, one that sought to provide the necessary security for the protectors while simultaneously preserving the community-oriented philosophy that makes the American Samoa Police Department unique. By successfully merging these two mandates, The department has become a model for other small, remote jurisdictions that are similarly grappling with the need to modernize while protecting the traditional character of their homes. The officers who patrol today do so as professionals who understand the history of their organization, who value the legacy of their predecessors, and who remain committed to the highest standards of integrity and duty. As we cast our gaze toward the future of the territory, it is evident that the narrative of the Fagatogo tragedy is no longer a wound, but a part of the structural integrity of the island's future. It has been fully processed and integrated into the public and private understanding of what it means to live, work, and serve in the territory. The story serves as a permanent, cautionary, and yet ultimately optimistic guidepost, ensuring that the errors and the vulnerabilities of the past are not repeated. The territory has established a new baseline of expectation, one where the rule of law is absolute, the guardians are empowered, and the safety of the public is treated as the primary, non-negotiable mission of the state. This clarity of purpose is the greatest dividend of the long and agonizing journey that began in 2010. We must also recognize the significance of the finality achieved in 2016. The sentencing of Sialmo Jr. was the closing of the chapter on the individual responsibility for the massacre, and it allowed the focus of the entire territory to shift entirely toward the future. The law had spoken. The individual was removed from the society he had harmed, and the system had demonstrated its capacity to carry the weight of its own justice. The fact that this was achieved through the slow, methodical, and often frustrating process of the courtroom underscores the territory's commitment to the foundational principles of due process, even under the most extreme of circumstances. The law did not seek an emotional vengeance. It sought the formal, legal accountability that is the hallmark of a mature society. In doing so, it provided the essential finality that allowed the survivors, the family of Lieutenant Brown, and the public to finally look beyond the date of the massacre and embrace the possibilities of the years that lay ahead. Finally, the conclusion of this narrative requires us to appreciate the enduring nature of the peace that has been reclaimed. It is a peace that is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of a robust, prepared, and deeply committed system of justice and protection. It is a peace that is guarded by individuals who know the cost of the safety they provide, and who stand ready to uphold that peace with the wisdom that only such a history can provide. The islands remain a place of profound connection, of deep cultural roots, and of a strong, enduring communal identity. They are also, significantly, a place that has learned the hard, necessary lesson that true peace must be actively maintained and vigilantly protected. This realization is the bedrock upon which the future of the territory rests. It is a future that is secured by the memory of the past, powered by the professional capabilities of the present, and defined by the unwavering commitment of a people who have proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that they are capable of surviving, adapting, and thriving in the face of the most unimaginable adversities. This narrative is now a complete whole, a thorough documentation of an event that threatened the peace of the territory, but ended up being the very thing that solidified it. The tragedy of Fagatogo has been laid to rest in the archives of history, not because it has been forgotten, but because it has been understood, contextualized, and transcended. The sacrifice of Lieutenant Brown and the heroism of his colleagues have been honored by the continued, professional service of those who have taken up their mantle. The community is healed, the institutions have been strengthened, and the rule of law stands taller than ever before. We can conclude this account with a firm belief that the legacy of those who gave their all on that morning remains in the safe, capable hands of the generations that follow, a future that is as peaceful as the islands themselves, and as guarded as the duty that defines them. The duty is sacred, the mission is eternal, and the memory of the fallen is the perpetual heartbeat of a territory that has looked into the darkness, stood its ground, and stepped out into a brighter, more secure day, forever bound by the commitment to protect the peace they have worked so tirelessly to reclaim and preserve for all time. The story concludes here, but the legacy of the duty continues, unchanging and resolute, in every act of service, every enforcement of the law, and every moment of peace that is enjoyed by the people of American Samoa, now and forevermore.